Welcome to this first session on one of the three verbal question types, sentence corrections. So let's begin by just discussing how the sentence corrections fit within the overall verbal section in regards to question frequency. So sentence corrections are assumed to not be the least frequent question type. So it's not going to be sentence corrections that you see most rarely. In general, the sentence corrections are going to be assumed to be approximately equal in number in your average verbal section on the GMAT to the number of reading comprehension questions that you will see. So generally somewhere in the range of 12 to 15 of these questions per verbal section. Usually there are 2 to 3 more sentence corrections than critical reasonings as well. So the critical reasonings are actually the most rare of the verbal question types generally on the GMAT. And because of that, the sentence corrections can frequently impact your score overall more on the verbal section than anything else from a improvement perspective, because if you can improve on the sentence corrections, especially in terms of pace, then you'll be able to allocate more time to your reading comprehension and critical reasoning questions, which frequently require more attention to detail. So strategically, you're going to want to allocate approximately a minute 30 per question to your sentence correction questions. This is about 20 seconds less than the average question type as assumed by the exam, being that there are 36 questions allocated in a verbal section in 65 total minutes. Now, you're going to have a maximum of 2 minutes for any sentence correction question, because very frequently what will occur with sentence corrections is you'll be able to identify an issue to evaluate, and if you're not able to determine which option is correct, it frequently does not get any better whether you spend 30 seconds evaluating the difference or spend approximately 3 minutes doing so, because you'll just kind of waffle and go back and forth on your options. So it's best to just avoid that entirely and have a rather strictly imposed 2-minute maximum for a sentence correction. And you're also going to minimize yourself to a single reread before moving to eliminate and guess on your sentence corrections. When we get into the process that we will illustrate here momentarily, we're going to talk about how you don't want to just listen for errors and try to abstractly read the sentences and read the choices back into the sentence one at a time, trying to just determine almost arbitrarily what the right answer is. Instead, we're going to focus on small, discrete differences and clinically eliminate answer choices, and only read once at the beginning of the problem and then once at the end. Furthermore, you can consider skipping these question types proactively if upon your first read you fully cannot understand the sentences written. So if you're just struggling to comprehend what the sentence is saying, it's probably best to cut bait and move on to your next verbal question briskly rather than struggling through determining what the meaning is. So since the sentence corrections are all self-contained, one question at a time format, you can, to a degree, with some level of discretion, decide pretty quickly that you may want to just skip over a question if you're immediately not really understanding the sentence or looking at the choices and saying, I can't determine the differences. So now, let's consider a sample sentence correction. So we've got a sample sentence correction here of the quick brown fox jump over the lazy dog. So you're always going to have a single sentence with an underlined portion to evaluate. In this case, fox jump over the lazy dogs is going to be part of the non-underlined portion of this original sentence, which is always assumed to be correct as written. And you ultimately will end up using that non-underlined portion as sort of an answer key to compare your choices against. Now, the first choice, A, is always going to be the exact same as the underlined section was presented in the original. And choice A is going to be correct as frequently as any other choice is correct. So you want to just assume that A could be the right answer. And this, in many cases, is a little bit of a difficult proposition for GMAT test takers because many students just assume that the original sentence is incorrectly written to begin with. That is not the case, and approximately 20% of the time, which is just a 1 out of 5 probability, choice A is going to be correct. So allow yourself to choose A if each of the other choices has an error. So choices B through E are going to present varying alternatives for the underlying portion. As you can see here, we've got a bunch of differentiations. We've got one that says foxes, we've got one that says A, we've got a whole bunch of differentiation. And it's your job to figure out what makes these answer choices incorrect. So for choice A, in the original, we can see the quick brown fox, and fox is the subject, and that's a singular fox, as indicated by the article the as well. So we've got one fox, but the verb here of jump is a plural verb. It's not an absolute in English, but generally one of the two pieces in a subject-verb pair is going to conclude in the letter S. So in this case, we've got a subject-verb error as written from singular to plural. So choice A can be eliminated right off the bat. Then we look at choice B, and it corrects it too much because it switches to foxes jumps. It should be foxes jump or fox jumps, not switching both pieces of the subject-verb pair. And then we've got that word there at the end as well that indicates possession for the fox as it pertains to the lazy dogs. And that's not supported by the sentence as written, so we're going to have to get rid of choice B for a couple of reasons. Then choice C changes the verb once again to jumping, and if we've got the quick brown fox jumping over the lazy dogs, that's just describing the fox, and we've actually lost our primary verb for the entire sentence and have thus created a fragment. So choice C would be eliminated here as well. Now D, we've got the quick brown fox jump, same error from the original, which we'll talk about how you want to make sure that maybe this is even the first error that you get rid of during the actual exam. So we know that's wrong, and we don't even have to consider the idea that a lazy dog may be lying down, but not a lazy dogs, because A is singular, and again, dogs is not. So we are left with choice E, and in choice E, we would read back in just to confirm that the sentence makes sense with that choice inserted. And sure enough, the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dogs. All makes sense. You've got a fox that jumps over dogs, and everything is logically coherent. So our sentence correction process, fully explained. Step 1 is always going to be to read the full sentence while attempting to identify and articulate a common error in the original as written. In the example we just saw, we saw a subject-verb error. It's going to be one of the common errors we will talk about in a bit more detail in a moment. Step 2 is if you identify an error, eliminate choice A, which is the original as written, and any other choices that repeat the category of error. So if you recall back to the prior slide, we saw that choice D had the exact same error. You can eliminate that potentially out of order and save yourself some time in considering all of the facets of choice D. Now, if no error is identified, you have to keep choice A. And you're going to want to seek small differences in the other choices to identify some errors as reasons to eliminate. And you don't want to just read the choice in full and listen for errors. You want to really granularly identify issues to evaluate based on the specifics of the sentence. Step 3 is going to be to keep evaluating the choices for those succinct, specific errors until only one choice remains potentially error-free, at which time you'll move to step 4 and read your selection back into the sentence to ensure that it captures the intended meaning of the original, because meaning is always going to be more important than abstract grammar in considering your sentence correction choices on the GMAT. So never lose sight of the meaning in preference of noting like abstract grammar rules. Those arcane, obscure things can often keep you from noticing a rather major issue as it pertains to meaning. So let's talk about some of those common errors in meaning. So the first is the primary error that we saw in the example moments ago. So subject-verb agreement is important because that is literally what makes a sentence a sentence. Every sentence, in order to be complete, must contain both a subject and a verb. Now, the first way that subjects and verbs can be misaligned in a sentence is going to be the difference in number, and that would be the difference similar to what we saw in the example. Dogs would run while one dog runs. So you've got that clarification. Again, generally you're dealing with a single S at the end of one of the two items in a subject-verb pair, but again, it's not perfect because, unfortunately, in English, the plural of deer is deer. Just the nature of the language, as it were. Now, the other way in which subjects and verbs can be in disagreement is going to be by creating what is either known as a fragment or a run-on. So a fragment does not have a full subject and main verb predicate pair, whereas a run-on basically has two or more subject-verb pairs just slammed together in your sentence without proper punctuation. Because the fix to a run-on is frequently to create multiple sentences, very rarely will you find run-ons as the error in most sentence corrections, but they can show up. Whereas more likely you're going to see something like we saw in the previous example, where a fragment is created because you only have descriptions of the main subject, and the main subject never conducts a primary action for the verb in the sentence. Our next common error is going to be pertaining to verb tenses. The first way that you can have verb tenses change, of course, is going to be in terms of timing. So you can have past, present, and future. Now, there are some more complex verb tenses around past perfect, present perfect, future perfect. All of those can be tested, but really they're not tested frequently. We'll talk about them a little bit in a future lesson. And the main thing to recognize is that often those perfect tenses are a bit of a red herring, obscuring an easier issue to evaluate within the sentences, or within the single sentence. Now, conditionals, however, are an important meaning issue to differentiate, because you can't subtly have an answer choice go from "I will do my homework" to "I would do my homework," because "I will do my homework" indicates a certainty, whereas "I would do my homework" indicates a conditional. And those have a change in meaning. So you can't allow an answer choice to subtly change the meaning from the original unless the original had an error in its initial meaning. Now, the third common error is going to be what are known as pronouns and articles. So pronouns and articles are little terms that refer back to a subject or an object, usually a noun. So you've got differences in number, things like it versus they. You also have the idea of ambiguity, and that can tie into articles as well. So we've got this example of Bill, Bob, and Brent are at the store and he bought gum. That's not going to work because it's ambiguous. We don't know who bought the gum. It could be Bill, it could be Bob, it could be Brent. But you also can have an issue with an article between, say, the difference of a versus the. So take the example of if I were to ask someone for a banana, then I am asking for any banana. If I ask someone for the banana, it is then a specific banana, and probably the banana that they're holding and might want for themselves. So these little words of pronouns and articles are often very good opportunities to clinically eliminate something, because if you just work through them specifically referring back to whatever their referent term is, you can eliminate quite nicely. So you want to aggressively seek these three errors in every sentence and every choice because they are certain. There's no ambiguity when these ones are wrong, and you can trace back subjects and verbs and make sure that you're pairing a plural subject to a plural verb, or make sure that your verb tenses are all aligned. Make sure that your pronouns and articles are properly referring back or towards their proper reference. So aggressively seek these errors and focus on verbs, subjects, pronouns, and articles in every sentence correction to identify reasons to eliminate. So, furthermore, we also have ideas of modifier absurdity. So, for instance, placement of modifiers matter because your modifying phrase, your descriptor, has to describe the closest possible subject. So, if I wanted to introduce, say, the greatest painting, Pablo Picasso's Guernica, that works. But if I said the greatest painting Pablo Picasso painted Guernica, you're like, well, no, because Pablo Picasso is not a painting, he's a painter. So always interpret the sentences literally. Do not allow your brain to fix errors that are literally absurd. And then you have to be careful as well with adjectives and adverbs. It's, again, a lesser tested issue than that idea of just absurd modification making a sentence be completely illogical, but you can have the technical difference between I run slow versus I run slowly. Remember that adverbs are going to describe verbs, adjectives, and other adverbs, whereas adjectives can only describe nouns. So while I run slow sounds okay to most English-speaking ears, it's technically incorrect because you have to describe the act of running, the I run, with the slowly, not just a slow. Then we have the idea of parallelism and comparison. So these are dealing with lists and literal comparison. So you have to make sure that if you've got a list, every part of the list is parallel, as it would be here. I ate, past tense, I ran, past tense, and I slept, past tense. These are all past tense things. That is an apt list. But you also have to make sure that conceptually your parallelism in the list or in a comparison is consistent. So you wouldn't be allowed to say a statement such as, my favorite teams are the A's, Raiders, and I like Man U, because you're listing teams, so you have to list the actual team of the A's, of the Raiders, and then you could say Man U, but you can't say I like Man U first, because now you've broken the parallelism of that list. And the last common error is probably the most difficult to deal with, which is idioms. So idiomatic rules are basically your memorized English rules. And for many GMAT test takers, they tend to be the first step of trying to just memorize your way to success. Unfortunately, it doesn't really work with great success because there are just so many of these rules, such as fewer counts number, less counts amount. So I can have fewer dollars than my neighbor, but I'd have less money because money is just an amount. Fewer would be the actual number of dollars. It's just the nature of English, and that's a rule that you either know or do not know. So for that reason, for idiom, you want to use these as the final issue to evaluate, unless you are absolutely certain of what the error is that you've identified and of the proper fix. You've got to be able to say, okay, I know it's got to be fewer because it's counting number. That less is incorrect. Don't allow yourself to select an answer that you're only halfway certain about, when there may have been a better answer or a better issue to evaluate that perhaps from the prior errors, be it a pronoun that's misplaced, a subject-verb pair that's certainly wrong from a numbering perspective. Use those more certain reasons to eliminate, as opposed to just noticing an idiom and trying to decide, well, is it among, is it between? Is it among, is it between? And not really knowing for certain. So, again, ensure certainty with all three of these common errors in meaning to properly evaluate the choices, because you have to be certain of these ones. It's a little bit easier to just kind of convince yourself if something doesn't sound right, that maybe it's a bad modifier, or maybe it's a bad parallelism, or maybe it's a bad idiom. And in fact, if you use official GMAT explanations, frequently they'll just use these terms almost with complete, we'll say, arbitrary, just completely arbitrarily, and you will just read things like, illogical parallelism or idiom, and it doesn't really distinguish what the actual error is at all for you moving forward. So let's go ahead and take a look at a sample sentence correction so that we can see how this process and these common errors may manifest themselves within the exam. Okay, so we have this sample sentence correction that would fit under the rubric of the GMAT. So Always set up your Scratchpad first so that you can process and eliminate as you go through these answer choices. And we're going to just put a line over top of these answer choices, as you would on the actual exam, for placing the common error that you identify as the issue potentially in either the sentence as originally written or by evaluating the choices against each other. So, we start with the original. The growth rate has subdued some. This was remarkable because it had nevertheless extended the current growth streak to 5 years or 1 year longer than that of the next most recent consecutive cargo growth streak. So, remembering our first three common errors, we look at verb tense because we start with though the growth rate has subdued some. This was remarkable. So has would be present tense, was would be past tense. So we've identified a verb tense issue and we just label out that on top of the answer choices and we can eliminate choice A knowing that A is the sentence as written. Then we want to look at our verb tenses to see if there are any other answer choices that repeat that category of error. Now, in choice B, we have was, and that's at least the proper parallelism, so we'll hold on to B for now, and we're just focusing on verb tenses at this point. Now, if we look at choice C, we have almost the exact same error, in that we've got has and was. Those two verb tenses are not going to match, so choice C is eliminated. Now, then we've got choice D, which again has was and was, seems reasonable to start. And then we've got choice E, which is dealing with was and was as well, so both D and E will hold with the squiggle for now. So then we want to think about those common errors that we talked about, and especially those first three of subject-verb agreement, verb tenses, and pronouns, because those pronouns, those verb tenses, can frequently be easier ways to definitively get rid of some answer choices. So we want to look at the changes between B, D, and E, and C, if there are any other potential verb tenses or pronouns that we might be able to eliminate. So, looking at the differences between B and D pertaining to verb tense and pronouns, we've got this which that shows up in choice E. And if we see that which that shows up in choice E, we have to ask ourselves, what does this which refer to? And we say, okay, so though the rate of growth was though the rate of growth was subdued somewhat, which was nevertheless remarkable because it extended the current streak of growth to 5 years or 1 year longer than the next most recent consecutive cargo growth streak. We are just continuing to describe the growth rate. It never has a main verb. So this E, even though it was kind of identified because the which we thought about a pronoun, we discover that there's a subject-verb issue here. We've got a fragment. So that eliminates choice E. And we're left with only choices B and D. So we want to look at differences between the two. And we've got, with B, it starts with rate of growth and growth rate, and that's just a semantic issue. There's not going to be a great reason to evaluate that difference. It's not really fitting one of our categories, and so that means you just kind of want to move on from it. Same idea between somewhat subdued versus some subdued some. There is a little bit of preference towards the not including what option, but it's not an absolutely great reason to eliminate. Now, there is a word that moves, however. We've moved our recent in choice A here in choice B, and it's still at the end in choice D. And in choice D, it's talking about the next most recent consecutive cargo growth streak. And that makes sense from a comparative perspective. But if we consider choice B and talk about the rate of growth having been somewhat subdued, it was nevertheless remarkable because it recently extended the current streak of growth. Well, is it remarkable just because it extended or because it did it recently? It doesn't say it was done recently previously in choice A, so choice B changes the meaning. And that's always going to be a secondary error to be aware of, in that you cannot change the meaning of the sentence without reason because of the original being incorrect. That placement of recent was fine in the original, so we can't suddenly say that it was remarkable because the rate of growth recently extended the current streak of growth, and that honestly even sounds to a degree redundant. So we eliminate choice B, and at this point, we just read choice D back into the original sentence to confirm that it has a coherent meaning and articulates what the sentence intended in the original. So, though the growth rate was subdued some, it, meaning the growth rate, was nevertheless remarkable because it, again meaning the growth rate, extended the current streak of growth to 5 years or 1 year longer than the next most recent consecutive cargo growth streak. Everything makes logical sense here. We select choice D, and we will then move on to the next question in the verbal, and you should go ahead and practice identifying these common errors in your sentence correction practice.